somebody says, if anybody does, it'll be Brett Johnson. So he comes up to me one day and I'm like, he's like, are you Brett Johnson? I was like, yeah. He's like, do you know anything about game theory? And I was like, yes, I do. So I start rattling off Prisoner's Dilemma and everything else. He's like, would you teach a class? So I start teaching that. I start teaching inmates public speaking and to make friends with this counselor. So it gets time where I'm supposed to be transferring out to this drug program that they only have in Fort Worth. And the transfers are taking like 4 or 5 months. That's 4 or 5 months I could be out free. So I went up to him one day and I was like, look, his name was Keeley. I was like, look, man, I said, is there any way that I can get transferred out any sooner? And he looks at me, he's like, Brett, I cannot help you. And I was like, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. So he said that. A week later, I'm on a bus. And I'm going to Fort Worth. So he got me to Fort Worth. I got it. Yeah. I love it. So it was a 9-month program, 24 hours a day of cognitive behavioral therapy. It had nothing to do with drugs. It was all peer study stuff and CBT training. And honestly, it's the best thing we could ever have. It truly is.
Well, that part, what is it? What was the thing that changed you as a man? Was it the solitary confinement? Was it the years? Was it losing the people you love? Or was it that behavioral therapy?
It's a combination, man. It's a combination. It was, so my sister disowned me. The only person I had in my life. You know, I mean, me and my sister, that's it. You know, I mean, yeah, I loved Elizabeth. I love my wife now, but, you know, it's me and my sister, we worked through all that shit together. So Denise disowns me. She doesn't talk to me for an entire year when all this stuff happens. And after I get arrested on the escape, she ends up driving 7 hours to come see me and tell me she loves me. And I don't see her again for 5.5 years. Yeah. So that's really the first turnaround. It took me 2.5 years in prison to accept responsibility.
That was amazing that she did that.
Yeah.
She drove down.
Yeah. Yeah, she's something. She's something. Yeah, she saw me for 10 minutes, tell me she loves me, and then I don't
planted the seeds.
But
yeah, you had time to think.
Yeah. It took 2.5 years to realize that I didn't commit crime because of some stupid girlfriends or wives or family. I committed it because I wanted to, chose to, and that's the first turnaround. The second turnaround is like the CBT training. You know that it didn't really hit while I was in prison. You know, I went through it and they ingrained it in me, but until you choose to make it work, it doesn't work. So I got out in 2011, didn't want to break the law, didn't I? And I was under 3 years probation, couldn't touch a computer. I had a job offer, but unhealthy ones, hot unhealthy ones.
Yes.
So,
love.
Yeah,
that's how that works.
Yeah. So I had a friend. So I had a friend post an ad for me on Plenty of Fish, and this woman responds. My wife, she responds. My wife, she responds. The pictures I had taken were these prison values, serious, like, they were there. She sends me a message of, why aren't you smiling? And my response was, that is my happy face. So we started talking, and we started dating, and she's a second Sadie, and I ended up moving in with her. I was going broke, I was about to get kicked out of the apartment and everything else, and she didn't say it, but I think she knew it. And moved in with her, and I got a job. And the job I got, my probation officer let me have a cell phone. I was going through Craigslist. This guy was advertising for a cell phone. I was going through Craigslist. This guy was advertising for landscaping. Called him up. His name was Dustin Durenas. Called him up, and he's like, I say, it got cold and the grass started to stop growing. The truth of the matter was, I thought I found another job. Guy was offering to pay me $1,500 a week, doing the sales for oil rig training is what it was. And I accepted the job. I quit working for Dustin. And the guy, I told him before he even offered me the job, I told him my criminal history, because at that point I'm crying. Probation officer stands up, and he was like, we think Mr. Johnson's a good guy. We think this is a one-time thing. Prosecutor says the same thing. Judge says sentences me to 1 year. Probation officer stands back up, and he's like, Mr. Johnson, the judge, if you can give Mr. Johnson a year and a day, he can get the good time and get back to his families. So the judge amends the sentence to a year and a day. So I served 10 months. They sent me back to Texas. And that's where I find out that Michelle didn't need me before I could get her. She just wanted me for me that entire time. She stands by me the entire time. I do my 10 months, get out, we get married after that. And they kill probation. So I can touch a computer. They tell you, they're like, inmates are felons, if nothing else, you can sell cars. Well, it turns out you can't. You can sell cars if you're a drug dealer. You're the guy that steals all the money and people's information. No, you can't get a job selling cars.
Of, of, and also to Elizabeth, like the human beings
Yes.
that love, that live, that are friends with cyber criminals.
There's so many lessons to really be had from that. To me, the lesson, the one big, to me, the lesson, the one big lessons to me is you can't serve two masters. You can't serve two masters. If you're that guy that is committing crime, that person that's if you're that guy that is committing crime, that person that's addicted, or you're in love with somebody that's addicted or has that, they don't love you. They love that addiction. That comes first. It's always going to come first. So you have to realize that. You have to know when to cut somebody off, when to end something that they're not going to change until they decide to change. At the same time, you got to realize that the only reason I was able to turn my life around is because people took that chance on me.
More and more companies are coming online.
Right.
They're becoming digital, and that it's just more and more and more. And those vulnerabilities in terms of human nature, so for social engineering and the actual outdated systems, all of it. And some way that I guess is you're exceptionally good at this, is educating on the social engineering side.
Right.
Is educating people in companies that
You've got to do that. And companies have to. I made that point that they never report to law enforcement. That's companies and individuals. I've worked with Fortune 50 companies that will not press charges. Instead, they'll have that insider or that criminal sign an NDA. They'll pay them off, and we won't mention this shit anymore. You have to press charges. You have to report. You have to raise the awareness of everyone in the group. You have to be. It's that idea, and I've talked about that before, of understanding your place in that cybercrime spectrum. The way a criminal will victimize you depends on who you are and what you do as a person and as a business. So you have to understand that. Design security around that. We've got 7,500 security companies out there. A whole lot of them are snake oil salesmen. A lot of them is going to tell you that we're the one-stop solution, but you're not. You're a tool, all right? And you may have a very good tool, but it's not the only tool that's needed to protect against the attacks that are out there. And we have to be open and honest about that kind of stuff.
So I guess defense is not just like any protection. By the way, you wrote on LinkedIn something about IDV. What is it? Why is it a problem? I was going down the rabbit hole.
I was wondering if you were going to mention that. They lost. I guess I was partially responsible for them losing that $86 million contract.
What was the contract with the
IRS? Yeah, the
IRS. So what is it?
So IDV is an identity. Okay, backtrack. IDV is a marketing company that wants to say they're an identity verification company.
I just want to bring this up to see you get angry.
Okay. I'll tell you what my issue is.
Yeah.
My issue is.
It's a company that's used for authentication by the IRS, I guess.
Well, IRS, Social Security Administration.
You don't think that should be handed over to lightly?
No. Absolutely not. Who would have thought that Brett Johnson would ever become a privacy advocate? And certainly you've got a host of companies. IBM is not the only one, but you've got some of these companies that say, well, we strip out the PII of the individual. We're just using the biometrics and the sites they're visiting and things like that. That's identity. That is, you can still ping that one unique individual out of all using that information. Stripping out the PII, you can still ping who that individual is.
So, having lived a life of crime for many years, I'm sure you've connected indirectly to a large.
I'm the guy that says what needs to be said. I've built my trust in this industry by not being scared of calling out companies and individuals, and not being scared of targeting criminals or criminal groups.
Your honesty as a human being, emotionally and intellectually, is really refreshing. It's a gift. I mean, thank you for doing that. Is there a advice you can give to young people today about life? You broke many rules, all the rules. Some rules should be broken. You do all right. If you do all right. If you make it out of this century, what do you think? Make it out of this century. What do you think would be the reason? Would be the reason?
That's a damn good question. That's a damn good question. I mean, we got a lot of bad stuff going on.
We got a lot of reasons. We got a lot of reasons. As to the other question of how you think human civilization will destroy itself, I'm sure you have a thing. Human civilization will destroy itself. I'm sure you have. I've read about it.
You know what? I've read about it. You know what gives me hope is
history books. You know, I feel like that's the right perspective I take on modern times. You know, how will this time be written about in the history books?
Yeah.
And react to that. Don't the daily ups and downs and the outrages, which is getting worse and worse in terms of how quick the turnaround is in terms of the news.
I'll tell you what, I'm sitting here, I appreciate you talking to me. I do, because I'm talking about their relationship and everything. It's kind of realization put me on a lot of things. So I really appreciate you asking those questions and everything, being able to talk about that.
I love it that you value. First of all, you're self-aware how important love is in a human being's life. It can make you do some of the best and some of the worst things in this world, and it's good to think about that. That is what makes us human, is that connection and that love for each other. What do you think is the meaning of life? This big ridiculous question. Why the hell? What are we all here for?
I don't think it is ridiculous, man. To me, that meaning of life is finding out that lesson that we need to help each other. If you ask about security, how do you get to say that? Everybody's worried about themselves. The way you solve that security problem is it takes everybody looking out for everyone else. That's how you solve that problem.
And however you take, whatever journey you take to discovering that point.
Yeah. I mean, with me, I've been asked a few times, do you regret anything? Would you change anything? I've done a shitload of despicable things in my life. But I'm at a point in my life where I like who I am. And I know that I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing in my life. So would I change anything? As bad as a lot of that shit has been, I wouldn't.
It made you who you are.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
I mean, that's trite to say that, but it's true. That's the weird thing. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, you mentioned that you're thinking of launching a show. What's it going to be called? Because you've done a couple of podcasts. You're incredibly good at this. You're so good at this.
I've done a couple. I'm on a lot of podcasts and everything like that. I had the Fraudcast with a friend of mine, Teresa, and that ended because of a difference of opinion. Depending on who you asked, one of us was an asshole.
Yes.
It may have been me.
Yeah.
But then I did the Anglerfish podcast, which I got to be honest with you, Lex, it was completely directionless. And it was Brett Johnson getting lazy. So I ended that. The Brett Johnson show is launching.
That's the new one.
That's the new
one.
And,
What do you think of doing with it?
Making a difference for one thing. But it's going to be talking about cybercrime security.
Interview. What are your thoughts on the ongoing war in Ukraine? How do you analyze it within your framework of the ongoing war in Ukraine? How do you analyze it within your framework about war?
How far would they go to hang on to power when push came to shove? Is, I think, the thing that worries me the most, and is plainly what worries most people about the rest of the nuclear war. Like, at what point does that unchecked leadership decide that this is worth it? Especially if they can emerge from the rubble still on top.
The following is a conversation with Chris Blattman, professor at the University of Chicago, studying the causes and consequences of violence and war. This he explores in his new book called Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Path to Peace. The book comes out on April 19th, so you should pre-order it to support Chris and his work. This is a Lux Friedman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Chris Blattman. In your new book, titled Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Path for Peace, you write, quote, "Let me be clear what I mean when I say war. I don't just mean countries duking it out. I mean any kind of prolonged, violent struggle between groups. That includes villages, clans, gangs, ethnic groups, religious sects, political factions, and nations. Wildly different as these may be, their origins have much in common. We'll see that the Northern Irish zealots, Colombian cartels, European tyrants, Liberian rebels, Greek oligarchs, Chicago gangs, Indian mobs, Rwandan genocidaires, any word ever, thank you to you. Those are people who administer genocide. English soccer hooligans, and American invaders. So, first, let me ask, what is war? In saying that war is a prolonged violent struggle between groups, what do the words prolonged, groups, and violent mean?
I sit at the sort of intersection of economics and political science, and I also dwell a little bit in psychology, but that's partly because I'm married to a psychologist, sometimes doing research with her. All these things are really different. So if you're a political scientist, you spend a lot of time just classifying a really narrow kind of conflict and studying that. And that's an important way to make progress as a social scientist. But I'm not trying to make progress. I'm trying to sort of help everybody step back and say, you know what, there's like some common things that we know from these disciplines that relate to a really wide range of phenomena. Basically, we can talk about them in a very similar way and we get really similar insight. So I wanted to actually bring them together, but I still had to say, let's hold out individual violence, which has a lot in common, but individual
level of understanding of why it happened and how it can be avoided.
Right, and a common, basically recognize that common principles govern the kinds of behavior that look pretty different. Like an Indian ethnic riot is obviously pretty different than invading the neighboring country, right? But and that's pretty different than two villages or two gangs. A lot of what I work on is studying organized criminals and gangs. Two gangs, what you think is really different, and of course it is. But there are some common principles. You can just think about conflict and the use of violence, and not learn everything, but just get a lot. Just get really, really far by sort of seeing the commonalities rather than just focusing on the differences.
So again, those words are prolonged, groups, and violent. Can you maybe linger on each of those words? What does prolonged mean? Where's the line between short and long? What does groups mean? And what does violent mean?
So let me, I have a friend who, someone who's become a friend through the process of my work and writing this book also, who was 20, 30 years ago was gang leader in Chicago. This guy named Napoleon English or Nap. And I remember one time he was saying, well, when I was young, he was 15, 16, and he'd go to the neighboring gangs very know that he was a tough guy, and he was fearless, and he was someone who that you should be careful with. And so I didn't want to call that war, right? That was that's something different. It was short, it was kind of sporadic, and he wasn't. And he was basically trying to send them information. And this is what countries do all the time, right? We have military parades, and we might have border skirmishes, and and I wanted to sort of, so is it, what's short, is a 3 month border skirmish a war? I mean, I don't try to get into it, but I want to point out that like these long grueling months and years of violence are like part of the problem and the puzzle, and I didn't want to. This is,
as you described, for everybody. So everybody is losing in this war.
yeah, I mean, that's maybe the insight. Everybody loses something from war, and there was usually, not always, but the point is, there was usually a way to get what you wanted and be better off without having to fight over it. So there's this, just saying, fighting is just politics by other means. Over time said, we're going to code years of war between these groups or within a country. And what's interesting is how difficult these data sets don't often agree. You have to make all of these, the decision gets really complicated. Like, when does the war begin, right? Does it begin when a certain number of people are killed? Did it begin, what if there's like lots of skirmishing and sort of lots of little terror attacks or a couple bombs go off, and then eventually turns into war? Do we call that, do we backdate it to like when the first acts of violence started? And then what do we do with all the times when there was like that low scale, low intensity violence or bomb drop? And do we call those wars, or maybe only if they eventually get worse? Like, it actually is really tricky.
And the defensive and the offensive aspect. So everybody, Hitler in World War II, it seems like he never attacked anybody. He's always defending against the unjust attack of everybody else as he's taken over the world. So that's like information propaganda that every side is trying to communicate to the world. So you can't listen to necessarily information like self-report data. You have to kind of look past that somehow. If you look, especially in the modern world, as much as possible at the data, how many bombs dropped, how many people killed, how the number of.
I suppose I think my God tells me to do something, or my God thinks that, or my moral sense thinks that something that another group is doing is repugnant. I'm curious, like, are they evaluating like the validity of that claim, or just the idea that, like, well, you said it was repugnant, you deeply believe that, therefore it's just.
I think could be corrected on a lot.
And so it was completely avoidable in one sense. But if you believe, and I think it's probably true, if you believe that for their own belief, and I think it's probably true, if you believe that for their own ideological and other reasons, um, Mulomar, other reasons, um, Mulomar, particular, and Taliban in general, decided we're not going to do this. Taliban in general decided we're not going to do this. Then now you're not left with very many good choices. Now you're not left with very many good choices. And now I didn't want to talk about, is that a just war, or is that what I didn't want to talk about, is that a just war, or is that what's justice or not? Justice or not? I just wanted to point out that, like, one side. I just wanted to point out that, like, one side's intransigence. If that's indeed what happened, one side's intransigence sort of maybe, if that's indeed what happened, one side's intransigence sort of maybe compels you to basically,
You communicate that purpose honestly with the global community, and you strike hard, fast, and you pull out. To do sort of, it's as if rescue missions. It's almost like policing work. Sort of, it's as if rescue missions. It's almost like policing work. If there's somebody suffering, you go in and stop that suffering directly. You go in and stop that suffering directly. That's it. I think World War II is seen in that way. That there's an obvious aggressor that is causing a lot of suffering in the world and looking to expand the scale of that suffering. And so you strike, given the scale, you strike as hard and as fast as possible to stop the expansion of the suffering. And so that's kind of how they see. I don't know if you can kind of look with this framework that you presented and look at Hitler and think, well, it's not in his interest. Well, it's not in his interest to attack. That's why you also describe, very importantly, that war throughout human history is actually rare. It was usually avoided.
Most people don't know about the U.S. invasion of Haiti in 1994. I mean, a lot of people know about it, but people just don't pay attention to it. We're gonna, the history books and school kids are gonna learn about the invasion. And now some political scientists go and they count up all of the nations. And now some political scientists go and they count up all of the nations that could fight. They have some dispute going after that. That could fight. They have some dispute going after that. One another, or they look at the ethnic one another, or they look at the ethnic groups that could fight with one another because there's some tension and they're right next to one another. And then whatever, some number like 900,000 don't fight. Because they just find some other ways. They don't like each other, but they just loathe in peace because that's the sensible thing to do. And that's what we all did. We loathed in peace. And we loathed the Soviet Union in relative peace for decades, and India loathes Pakistan in peace. Maybe 2 weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, again, it was in the newspapers, but most people didn't take note. India accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan and comments. So they're like, yeah, this is, we do not want to go to war. This will be bad. We'll be angry, but we'll accept your explanation that this was an accident. And so these things fly under the radar. And so we overestimate, I think, how likely it is sides are going to fight. But then, of course, things do happen. Like Russia did invade the Ukraine and didn't find some negotiated deal. And so then the book is sort of about half the book is just sort of laying out. Well, actually, like there's just different ways this breaks down, and some of them are human. Some of them are this. I actually don't think war beats in our heart. It does a little bit, but we're actually very cooperative. We're as a species, we're deeply cooperative. We're really, really good. The thing we're okay at violence, and we're okay getting angry and tension. And I guess I was saying there's 5 ways that they get overridden, and 3 are I call strategic. That they get overridden, and 3 are I call strategic. Like they're kind of logical. There's circumstances that and this is they're sort of strategic is strategy is like this. Game theory is strategic is strategy is like this. Game theory is you could use those two things interchangeably, but game theory is sort of making it sound more complicated, I think, than it is. It's basically saying that there's times when this is like the optimal choice because of circumstances, and one of them is when people who are deciding, and one of them is when people who are deciding don't bear those costs. So that, or maybe even have a private incentive that's those costs. So that, or maybe even have a private incentive that's gonna that's if they don't if they're ignoring the cost, then maybe the costs of the war are not. That's if they're ignoring the cost, then maybe the costs of the war are not so material. That's a contributing factor. Another is just there's uncertainty, and we can talk about that, but there's just the absence of information means that actually there's circumstances where it's your best choice to attack. There's this thing that political economists call a myth about what your opponent's going to do, and you stake out a high price, like a low price, and the seller stakes out a high price, and you might both say, "Oh, I could never accept that." There's all this sort of cheap talk, but you kind of understand where you're going, and it's efficient to like find a deal and buy the market, buy the market eventually. So we all understand this. It's like game theory and strategy just intuitively. Or maybe even a closer example is like suppose I don't know you have a tenant you need to evict, or anyone normal like kind of legal, or not, it's not yet a legal dispute, right? Like we just have a dispute with a neighbor or somebody else. Most of us don't end up going to court. Going to court is like the war option. That's the costly thing that just ought to be avoided. We ought to be able to find something between ourselves that
projects a simple model of the world that brings us comfort in thinking we understand.
Yeah.
And sometimes that simplification is actually getting at the core first principles understanding of something. And sometimes it fools us into thinking we understand. So, for example, I mean, mutually assured destruction is a very simple model. People argue all the time whether that's actually a good model or not. But there's empirical fact that we're still alive in the human civilization. And also, in the game theoretic sense, do we model individual leaders and their relationships? Do we, the staff, the generals, or do we also have to model the culture, the people, the suffering of the people, the economic frustration or the anger or the distrust? Do you have to model all those things? Do they come into play? And sometimes, I mean, again, we could be romanticizing those things from a historical perspective, but when you look at history, when you look at the way wars start, it sometimes feels like a little bit of a misunderstanding, escalates, escalates, and just builds on top of itself, and all of a sudden it's an all-out war. Um, it's the escalation with nobody hitting the brakes.
So I mean, you're absolutely right, in the sense that it's totally possible to oversimplify these things and take the game theory too seriously. And some, and people who study those things and write those models, and people like me who use them can sometimes make that mistake. I think that's not the mistake that most people make most or often. And what's actually true is I think most people, we're actually really quick, whether it's the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq, we're really quick to blame that on the humanness and the culture, and so we're really quick to say, oh, this was George W. Bush's either desire for revenge and vengeance, or some private agenda, or blood for oil. So we're really quick to blame it on these things, and then we tend to overlook the strategic incentives to attack, which I think were probably dominant. I think those things might have been true to a degree, but I don't think they were enough to ever, bring those wars about. Just like I think people are very quick to sort of, in this current invasion, to sort of talk about Putin's grand visions of being the next Catherine the Great, or nationalist ideals, or and the mistakes and the miscalculations. We're really quick to sort of say, oh, that must be, and then kind of pause, or not pause, but maybe even stop there, and not see some of the strategic incentives. And so I guess we have to do both. But the strategic, I guess I would say, like, the wars are such a big problem. It's just so costly that the strategic incentives has given us are like really important in understanding why there was so little room for negotiation and bargaining that things like a leader's mistakes start to matter, or a leader's nationalist ideals or delusions, or revenge, these things in the wild.
Before we zoom back out, let me, at a high level, first ask, what are your thoughts on the ongoing war in Ukraine? How do you analyze it within your framework of our work?
A Russian colleague of mine, Konstantin Sonin, tells this story about a visiting Ukrainian professor who's at the university, and one night he's walking down the street and he's talking on two cell phones at once for some reason. And a mugger stops him and demands the phones. And in sort of like deadpan way, Konstantin says, and because he was Ukrainian, he decided to fight. And I think Americans for the American Revolution, this is actually a very similar story. You had a tyrannical, militarily superior, pretty non-democratic entity come and say, you're going to have partial sovereignty. And Americans, for ideological reasons, said, no way. And that, people like Bernard Bailyn and other historians, that's like the dominant story of the American Revolution. It was an ideological origins, this attachment to this idea of liberty. And so now there's lots of other reasons, I think, why this happened, but I think for me it starts with Ukrainians failing to make that sensible, quote unquote, rational deal that says we should relinquish some of our sovereignty because Russia is more powerful than we are. Well, on the eve of the war, Ukraine was poorer in a per person terms than it was in 1990. The economy is just completely stagnated. And Russia, meanwhile, like many other parts of the region, has boomed to a degree. I mean, certainly because of oil and gas, but also for a variety of other reasons. And Putin's consolidated political control. And from a very cold-blooded and calculated point of view, I think one way Putin and Russia could look at this is that, look, we were temporarily weak after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the West basically took advantage of that. Like, bravo, you pulled it off. You basically crept democracy and capitalism, all these things right up to our border. And now we have regained some of our strength. We've consolidated political control. We've counted our people. We have a stronger economy, and we somehow got Germany and other European nations to give up energy independence, and actually just we've got an enormous amount of leverage over you. And now we want to roll back some of your success because we're powerful enough to demand it. And you've been taking advantage of the situation. But this may be a fair, impartial analysis. And the West, but more specifically Ukraine, says that that's a price too high, which I totally respect. I'd like to think I'd make that same decision, but that's the answer. If the answer is why would they fight if it's so?
Whatever the scale of pain, standing up, there's something in me that's proud. Maybe that's whatever the fuck that is. Maybe that's why I love them. I love the Ukrainian people, I love the Russian people. And whatever that fight is, whatever that suffering is, the millions of refugees, whatever the war is, the dictators come to power and their power falls. I just love that spirit burns bright still. And I do, maybe I'm wrong in this, do see Ukrainian and Russian people as one people in a way that's not
On, and it's asking for something, and there's an incentive to give that up. That's obvious. Like, there's an incentive to comply. But my understanding is many of these post-Soviet republics have appeased, right, which is what we call compromise when we disagree with it. They've all of these other peoples in the Russian sphere of influence have not stood up. And many Russians have tried to stand up, and they've been beaten down. And now people we'll see, but people have not been standing up very much. And so lots of people are cowed, and lots of people have appeased, and lots of people hear that speech and think, I would like to do that, but don't. And my point is that, sadly, we live in a world where a lot of people get stepped on by tyrants and empire and whatnot, and don't rise up. And so I think we can admire, especially when they stand up for these reasons, and I think we can admire Churchill for that reason. That's why we admire the leader of the American Revolution and so on. But it doesn't always happen, and I don't actually know why. But I don't think it's irrational. I think it's something. It's about a set of values, and hard to predict. And it was hard. I think Putin might not have been out of line in thinking, just like everybody else in my sphere of influence, they're going to roll over too.
And I should mention, because we haven't, that a lot of this calculation, from an objective point of view, you have to include the United States and NATO into the pressure they apply into the region.
Yep.
That said, I care little about leaders that do cruel things onto the world. They lead to a lot of suffering, but I still believe that the Russian people and the Ukrainian people are great people that stand up, and I admire people that stand up and are willing to give their life. And I think Russian people are very much that too, especially when the enemy is coming for your home over the hill.
Yeah.
Sometimes standing up to an authoritarian regime is difficult because you don't know.
I think is the fundamental cause of most violence in the world. I think it's unaccountable power. I think, in fact, for me, an unaccountable power is the source of underdevelopment. It's the source of pain and suffering. It's the source of warfare. It's basically the root source of most of our problems. And in this particular case, it's also one of our buckets in the sense that why did Russia ask these things? Like, well, Was democracy in Ukraine a threat to an average Russian? No. Was capitalism, is NATO, is whatever, is this a threat to average Russians? No. It was a threat to the apparatus of political control and economic control that Putin and cronies and this sort of group of people that rule, this elite in Russia, um, it was a threat to them. And so they had to ask the Ukraine to be neutral or to give up NATO or to have a puppet government or whatever they were seeking to achieve and have been trying to achieve through other means for decades, right? They've been trying to undermine these things without invasion. And they've been doing that because it threatens their interests. And that's like one of these other logics of war. It's not just that there's something that I value so much that I'm willing to endure the cost. It's that there are people, not only does this oligarchy or whatever elite group that you want to talk about in Russia, not, first of all, they're not bearing they're bearing some costs of war, right? And they're certainly bearing costs of sanctions. But they don't bear all the costs of war, obviously. And so they're quick to use it. But more importantly, like, in some sense, I think there's a strong argument that they had a political incentive to invade, or at least to ask Ukraine this sort of impossible to give up thing, and then invade despite Ukrainian nobility and transigence because they were threatened. And so that's extremely important, I think. And so those two things in concert make this a very fragile situation. That is, I think, why we ended up go not all the way, but a long way to understand it. Now you can layer onto that these intangible incentives, these other things that are valued on Putin's side. Maybe there's a nationalist ideal. Maybe he seeks status and glory. But maybe those things are all true, and I'm sure they're true to an extent. And that'll weigh against his costs of war as well. But fundamentally, I think he just saw his regime as threatened. That's what he cares about, and so he made this cruelest of demands.
I mean, I would say I'm just one human. Who the hell am I? But I just have a lot of anger towards the elites in general, towards leaders in general that fail the people. I would love to hear and to celebrate the beautiful Russian people, the Ukrainian people, and anyone who silences that beautiful voice of the people anywhere in the world is destroying the thing that I value most about humanity. Leaders don't matter. They're supposed to serve the people. This nationalist idea of a people, of a country, only makes any sense when you celebrate, when you give people the freedom to show themselves, to celebrate themselves. The thing I care most about is science, and the silencing of voices in the scientific community, the silencing of voices, period. Fuck any leader that silences the human spirit. There's something about this, like, whenever I look at World War II, whenever I look at wars, it does seem very irrational to fight. Man, does it seem somehow deeply human when the people stand up and fight. There's something that if we talk about progress, that feels like how progress is made. The people that stand and fight. So let me read the Churchill speech. I'm so proud that we humans can stand up to evil when the time is right. I guess here's the thing. Think of what's happening in Xinjiang in China. We've appeased China. We basically said you can just do really, really, really horrible things in this region, and you're too powerful for us to do anything about it, and it's not worth it. And there's nobody standing up and making a Churchill speech or a Braveheart speech about standing up for the people of Xinjiang when what's happening is in that realm of what was happening in Europe, and that's happening in a lot of places. And then when there is a willingness to stand up, there's a lot of opposition to those. So there were a lot of reasons for the invasion of Iraq. For some, it was a humanitarian thing. Like Saddam Hussein was one of the worst
tyrants of the 20th century. He was just doing some really horrible things. He invaded Kuwait. He, committed attempted domestic genocide and all sorts of repression. And it was probably a mistake to invade, right? So it's important not just to select on the cases where he stood up, and to select on the cases where that ended up working out in the sense of victory, right? It's important to sort of try to not judge, but just try to understand these things in the context of all the times we didn't give that speech, or when we did, and then it just went sideways.
Well, that's why it's powerful when you're willing to give your life for your principles, because most of the time you get neither the principles nor the life. You die. But that's why it's powerful. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the field and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. This is before Hitler had any major loss to anybody. That was a terrifying armada coming your way. We shall never surrender. I just want to give props. I want to give my respect as a human being to Churchill, to the British people for standing up, to the Ukrainian people for standing up, and to the Russian people. These are great people that throughout history have stood up to evil. Let me ask you this, because you quote Sun Tzu in The Art of War. There's no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. This is the main thesis. Can we just linger on this? Since leaders wage war and people pay the price, when we say that there's no reason to do prolonged war, is it possible to have a reason for the leaders if they disregard the price? Sort of like if they have a different objective function or utility function that measures the price that's paid for war. Is that one explanation of why war happens? Is the leaders just have a different calculus than other humans?
I mean, I think this links us back to what we were talking about earlier about just war. Because in some sense, just war is saying that in spite of the cost, that our enemy has done something. Our opponent has refused to compromise on something that we find essential, and is demanding that we compromise in a way that's completely repugnant. And therefore, we're going to go to war despite these material costs and these human costs. So that and then that principle that we go to war on is in the eye of the beholder. And I mean, liberty and sovereignty, I think we can understand and sympathize with, and maybe that's just a universal. Maybe that's the greatest cause of just war. But other people could go to war for something considerably less, a principle that's considerably less noble, right? Which is what Hitler was doing. That's an explanation. So that's a whole class of explanations that helps us understand that the compromise that was on the table, given the relative balance of power, was just repugnant, at least to one side, if not that there's something they're willing to part with. And then you get to the leaders. Well, what happens when what the leaders want? What happens when the leaders are detached from the interest of their groups, which has been true for basically most of human history? There's a narrow slice of societies in the big scheme of things that have been accountable to the people. A lot of them exist today, where to some degree they're channeling the interests of their group, right? So the Ukrainian politicians didn't concede to these cruel Russian demands, because even if they had, it would have been political suicide. Because it seemed, or I think, it seems that the Ukrainians would have just rejected this. So they were in some sense channeling the values of the broader population, even if they, I don't know what was going. And if they didn't share those principles, they self-registedly followed them. Probably they shared them, but I'm just saying that even if they didn't, they wouldn't come. Occasionally you get the reverse, which is where the leaders are not accountable, and now they have some value, which could be glory. And this is the story of the kings, and to some lesser extent the queens of Europe, for hundreds of years. It was basically a contest, and war was the sport of kings, and to some extent they were just seeking status through violent that detachment of leaders combined with, you mingle it with that one bucket, that uncheckedness, and you mingle that with the fact that leaders might have one of these values, noble or otherwise, that carry them to war combined explain a good number of conflicts as well. And that's a good illustration of why I think like autocracy and unaccountable power is. I could make that story for all the things, all five buckets. We're all more susceptible to these things, to all five of these things, when leaders are not accountable to the people and their group, and that's what makes it like the meta, for me, the meta cause of conflict in all of human history, and sadly today.
Does the will to power play into this? The desire for power? Like, that's a human thing again in the calculation. That shall we put that in the misperceptions bucket, or is misperceptions essentially about interaction between humans, and power is more about the thing you feel in your heart when you're alone?
Yeah.
As a leader.
I said there were three strategic reasons, like the unchecked leaders, the commitment, promise, uncertainty. There are two sort of more psychological, and I call them intangible incentives and misperceptions. The way that like a game theorist, or the way that behavioral economists would think about those two, is just to say preferences and then erroneous beliefs and mistakes. It's like, so our preferences are our preferences,
yeah,
right? And so utility functions, whatever we want to call it, like there's not, and that's why I wouldn't call them a misperception or rationality. We like what we like.
Yeah.
If we like power, if we like relative status, uh, if we like our racial purity, if we like our liberty, if we like whatever it is that we have convinced ourselves we value.
Maybe you fell in love with a rival queen or king.
Exactly. When I said it was a big bucket full of stuff that rhymes, like that's a pretty messy bucket. Like there's a lot of different stuff in there, and I'm just trying to say, like, let's be clear that just with the shared logic of these things, maybe just they're really dissimilar, but let's be clear about the shared logic. And if it were true that deep down we were aggressive people who just liked violence and enjoyed the blood, or some percentage of us do, that would be there too. And so I just want to say that's, but we're really quick to recognize those, right? When we diagnose a war as an armchair analyst or as a journalist or something, we really jump to those. We don't need a lot of help to like see those happening. So we probably put a little bit too much emphasis on them. Is maybe the only thing that I would caution, because the others are more subtle, and they're often there and they contribute.
So I just looking at something you said before, would it be accurate to say when the leaders become detached from the opinion of the people, that's more likely to lead to war? So
mechanically, it's just they're going to bear fewer costs. So it's going to basically narrow the set of deals that they're going to be willing to accept instead of violence. At the same time, most of the time, it's not enough because the leaders still bear a lot of costs. I'm sure you could be deposed, you could be killed, you could be tried, and the public purse is going to be empty. Like, that's like the one story throughout history, is at the end of the day, your regime is broke as a result of war. And so you still internalize that a little bit. If I had to say, like, in my three buckets, or third my bucket so far, I've sort of started with like Ukrainian intransigence, and then I said the essential. Then you really have to understand Russian autocracy for them, just to understand why they would ask something so cruel. But I mean, I think the uncertainty is really important here as well. Like if you think of it, like think of all the things, the way this is played out, and just in some ways in how many ways we've been surprised. We've been surprised by the unity and the coherence of the West and the sanctions. That's sort of what's happened. Is it was in the realm of possibility, but it was sort of like the best case scenario from the perspective of the West and the worst case scenario for the Russians. The second thing is just the pluckiness and the effectiveness and the intransigence and the nobility of this Ukrainian resistance. That, again, was within the realm of possibility, but wasn't the certain likely thing, right? It was, again, maybe the worst realization for Russia, the best realization in some senses, in terms of revealed strength and resolve. And then the other thing that's been revealed is just how, like so Putin asking this terrible price and expecting Ukraine to roll over, or the West to roll over at least to a degree, was based on like a different set of probability. It was based on just expecting something in the middle of the probability distribution and not all these different tail events. And so the fact that the world is so uncertain, and the fact that Putin can come with a different set of expectations than the Ukrainians and the West, and all these players can just have a hard time agreeing on just what the facts are, because we live in an uncertain world. Everyone's quick to say, "Oh, he miscalculated." Well, I don't know if he miscalculated. I think he got a really bad draw on in terms of what the realized outcomes are here. And so, I mean, good for everybody else in some sense, except the fact that it's involving a lot of violence is the tragedy.
So, well, there's also economic pain, not just for the Russian people and the Ukrainian people, but for the whole world.
Yeah.
So it's we could talk about things that you are surprised from an analysis perspective, and small victories here or there, but I think it's universally true that everybody loses once again in this war.
Right, and so the question is like, when does it? Why did Russia choose to invade when Ukraine didn't seem to accept? Well, Russia anticipated that it would be able to seize what it wanted, the real of a bargain that it deserved, quote unquote, based on its power in the world, it wasn't getting, and so it thought it could take that. And the uncertainty around that made it potentially more likely that it would choose to do this. But in particular, one of the other things that I think is probably less important in this context, but still plays a role, but less important than in many wars, is the fact that it's really hard to resolve that uncertainty. Right? In theory, Ukraine should be able to say, look, this is exactly how resolved we are. We're super resolved. And your military is not as strong as you think it is.
You mean before the conflict begins?
Everybody should be like,
you know what? On the table, here's my card.
No one wants, yeah.
Here's your cards.
Exactly. Like that's, as a competitor in this, you can use that uncertainty to your advantage. I can try to convince you. I can bluff. All right? And so anyone who's ever played poker and bluffed or called a bluff, that's the inefficient. That's the analogy in some ways to war. It's not the perfect analogy, but the uncertainty in the circumstance. You don't have to miscalculate. The fact that if you bluff and lose, this is not you miscalculated. You made an optimal choice given the uncertainty of the situation to take a gamble, and that was a wiser thing for you to do than to not bluff and just to fold or to just not pay in that round. And so the uncertainty of the situation gives both sides incentives to bluff. Gives neither side an incentive to try to reveal the truth. And then at some point, the other side says, you know what? You say you're resolved. You say you're going to mount an uncertainty. Well, guess what? Every other, people on my border has folded, and you're going to fold too the minute the tanks roll in, and the minute the Air Force comes in. I'm gambling that you're bluffing. And so that inherent uncertainty of the situation just causes a lot of short wars, actually, because it's the sort of bluff and call dynamic that goes on. And the thing that's worth recognizing is we might end up at a place in a few months where the thing that Ukraine concedes is not so far from what Russia demanded in the first place. Russia saw it. I want a neutral. I mean, who knows how? It's not the ambitious thing the Russians wanted, but if we end up in a place where Ukraine is effectively neutral, never joins NATO, is not being militarily supplied by the West, and where Russia has de facto control over the East and Crimea, if not fully recognized, probably who knows if they'll get ever internationally Ukrainian recognized, but effectively controls, Russia will have accomplished what it asked for in the first place, and sadly is like the best case. That feels like the best case scenario right now, which is divorce just 5 months and not 5 years.
Given the current situation.
Given the current situation.
Because the suffering has already happened. They lost homes, people moving, having to see their home in rubble, millions of people, refugees having to escape the country, and hate flourishes versus the common humanity as it does with war. And on top of all of that, if we talk from a geopolitical perspective, the warmongers all over the world are sort of drooling. They've now got narratives, and they got whatever narratives. You can go shopping for the narratives. The United States has its narratives for whatever geopolitical thing it wants to do in that part of the world.
That's another little malevolent interaction between two of these buckets, like those unchecked leaders and those intangible incentives, those preferences, is that unchecked leaders autocrats, whatever, spend enormous amounts of time trying to manipulate the values and beliefs of their population or their group. Right? And now, sometimes they do it nobly, but that's what Winston Churchill there was trying to. It's not clear that Britons were like ready to stand up. There were a lot of Americans and a lot of Britons who were like, you know what? Hitler, not such a bad guy. His ideas, not so terrible. I never liked those Jews anyways. Many were thinking, right? We had political leaders in the U.S. who were basically not pro-Nazi, but were just not anti-Nazi. And Churchill was just trying to instill a different resolve. He was trying to create that thing. He was trying to create that value. And in the American Revolution, it was as well. Like the founding fathers, the leaders of the Revolution, it's not that everybody just woke up one morning in the United States and had this ideology of liberty and freedom. Some of that was true, it was out there in the ether, but they had to manufacture and create it. In a way that I think they believed and was noble. But there's a lot of manufacturing and creation of these values and principles that is not noble, and that is exactly what Hitler did so well.
The anti-Semitism was present throughout the world, but the more subtle thing that I feel like may be more generally applicable is this kind of pacifism that I think people in the United States felt like it's not my conflict. Why do I need to get involved with it? And I think Churchill was fighting that general
apathy.
It's like it's the apathy of rational calculus. Like what are we going to gain if we fight back? Like Hitler seems to be pretty reasonable. He's saying he's going to stop the bombing. That you're still going to maintain your sovereignty as the great people of Britain. Like why are we fighting again? And that's the thing that's hard to break because you have to say, well, you have to speak to principle. You have to speak at some greater sort of long-term vision of history. So like, yes, now it may seem like it's a way to avoid the fight, but you're actually just sort of putting shackles on yourself. You're destroying the very greatness of our people if we don't fight back.
And to think about this with like the current case with Russia, I mean, some people look at Putin's speeches and papers he's written on Ukraine historically being a part of Russia and trying to deny basically create all these nationalist narratives, and they think, well, Putin really believes, and he might, Putin really believes this, and that's why he's invading. And that might also be true, and that would contribute to just make a peaceful bargain even harder to find. But I suspect what's at least a minimum true is Putin's trying to manufacture support for an invasion in the population through propaganda. And so he's doing, on some level, the same thing that Winston Churchill was doing in mechanical terms, which is to try to manipulate people's preferences, but doing it in a sinister, malevolent, evil, self-serving way because it's really in his interest. Whereas this was anything but, right? In the Churchill example,
the dark human thing is like moments in World War II where Hitler's propaganda, he began to believe his own propaganda. It's like,
I think he probably always believed. I think he was a sincere believer.
well, no, no, no. There's a lot of places in where there's uncertainty,
Yeah.
and they decided to do propaganda,
Yeah.
and that propaganda resolved the uncertainty in his own mind. Like, so for example, he believed until very late that America is a weakling, militarily and as an economic power, and just the spirit of the people. And like that was part of the propaganda they're producing. And because of that propaganda, when he became the head of the army, he was making military actions. He like nonchalantly started war with America, the United States of America, where he didn't need to at all. He could have avoided that completely, but he thought, whatever, doesn't they're easy. So that's I think that propaganda first, belief second, and I think as a as a human being, as a dictator, when you start to believe the lies with which you're controlling the populace, you're not able to. You become detached from this person that's able to resolve in a very human way the conflict in the world.
I mean, when I said the big common factor that causes war over and over and over again is unaccountable power. It's not just because it's mechanically like one of my 5 explanations is saying, well, if you're unaccountable, you don't bear the cost of war, you might find other incentives. So yes, bargains are harder to find, but it leads to all these nasty interactions. So earlier I said there's this interaction between the values and the unchecked leaders because those idiosyncratic values of your leader become more important when they're unchecked. But the uncertainty point you just made is like a deep point. It's to say actually that like the fundamental problem that all autocrats have is an information problem because nobody wants to give them the right information. And they have very few ways to aggregate information if they're not popular, right? And so there's a whole cottage industry of political science sort of talking about why autocrats love fixed elections and why they love Twitter and why they actually like it in a controlled way is it solves an information problem. Like that's your crucial. If you're like Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, you need to solve an information problem just to avoid having a rebellion on your hands in your own country every day, because uncertainty kind of gets magnified and you get all this distorted information in this apparatus of control. And so that's like another nasty interaction between uncertainty and unchecked leaders is you end up in this situation where you're getting bad information, and it's not that you believe your own lies. It's just that you sort of believe you're sort of averaging what you believe over the available information, and you don't realize that it's such a distorted and biased information source.
One of the other things about this time that was a surprise to me in the fog of uncertainty, how sort of seemingly likely nuclear war became. Not likely, but how it
Less unlikely than before.
exactly, that's a better way to say it. It started to take a random stroll away from 0% probability into this kind of land of maybe like hard to know, but it's like, oh wow, we're actually normally talking about this as if this is part of the calculus, part of the options. But before we talk about nuclear war, because I'm going to need a drink, do you need to go to the bathroom?
Sure, I'll take a break.
Back to nuclear war. What do you think about this? That people were nonchalantly speaking about nuclear wars if it doesn't lead to the potential annihilation of the human species. What are the chances that our world descends into nuclear war? Within your framework, you wear many hats.
Yeah.
One is sort of the analyst, right? And then one is a human. What do you think are the chances we get to see nuclear war in this century?
Well, you know, the official doomsday clock for nuclear warfare sits in the lobby of my building. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists sort of shares a building with us, so it's always there every day.
Can you describe what the doomsday clock is?
The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists it's something that this group of physicists sort of said sort of marked just how close we are to nuclear catastrophe, and they started decades ago. And it's a clock, and it's sort of how close are we to midnight? The midnight is nuclear Armageddon or the destruction of humanity, and it's sitting. I mean, it's actually it hasn't moved as close to midnight in controversial, so it always sits there. But it forces you to think about it a little bit every day. Um, and I admit I was nonchalant about it until recently, in a way that many other people were. I still think the risk is very low, but um, kind of for the reasons we've talked, it's just so unimaginably costly that nobody wants to go there. So it's like the extreme version of my whole argument is why we most of the time don't fight is because it's just so damn costly. And so that's the incentive not to use this. And if they do use it, that's the incentive to use it in a very restrained way. Um, but that's not a lot of. But because we do go to war and there's all these things that interfere with it, including miscalculation and all these different variables, and several of those nuclear powers are not accountable leaders. I think we have to be a lot more worried than many of us were very recently. I pointed out earlier, like the whole reason we're in this mess is because the only people who have this private interest in like having Ukraine give up its freedom is this Russian cabal and elite that gets their power and is preserved only and is threatened by Ukrainian democracy. How far would they go to hang on to power when push came to shove? Is I think the thing that worries me the most, and is plainly what worries most people about the risk of nuclear war. Like, at what point does that unchecked leadership decide that this is worth it? Especially if they can emerge from the rubble still on top. I don't know. So, um, and I don't know that any of us have really fully thought through all of that calculus and what's going on. Very recently, around the anniversary of January 6th, there were a lot of questions about, oh, is the United States going to have another civil war? On the one hand, I think it's almost unimaginable. Sort of like, in the same way I think that nuclear war and complete Armageddon is unimaginable. But I remember something that when both of those questions get asked, I remember something I was in the audience and listening to some great economists speak about the 20 years ago, but the risk of an Argentina-style financial meltdown of the United States. Like, what's the total financial collapse? And they said, you know what? The risk is vanishingly small, but that's terrifying because until recently, the answer is zero. And so the fact that it's not zero should deeply, deeply scare us all, and we should devote a lot of energy to making it zero again. And that's how I feel about the risk of a civil war in the U.S., and that's how I feel about the risk of nuclear war. It's higher than it used to be, and that should terrify us all.
To me, what terrifies me is that all this kind of stuff seems to happen like overnight, like super quick. It escalates super quick when it happens. So it's not like I don't know. I don't know what I imagined, but it just happens. Like if a nuclear war happened, it would be something like a plane, like in this case with Ukraine, a NATO plane shut down over some piece of land by the Russian forces, or so the narrative would go. But it doesn't even matter what's true or not. It just sparked the first um, moment of escalation, and then it just goes.
Well, I think that happens sometimes. I mean, again, it's this thing that, you know, what social scientists call selection on independent variable. Like, there's all these times when that didn't happen, when it stopped, when it escalated one step, and then people paused, or it escalated two steps, and people said, whoa, 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 whoa. And so we remember the times when it went boom, 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 and then the really terrible thing happened. Well, fortunately, that's not, I start off the book with an example of a gang war that didn't happen in Medellin, Colombia, which is, my day job is actually studying conflict and gangs and violence and of these other kinds of groups, also very sinister. And most of the time they don't fight. That escalation doesn't happen. So the escalation does happen quickly sometimes, except when it doesn't. Which
We remember the ones when it does. It's really important to think about all that. Like when we're talking about, I think Elon Musk.
Dude, it's 12 straight games.
I was sort of like talking about the horrors.
You think you've
war
just played better, or just
and
slow?
he said, well, like most of human history, because I think I said like most of human history is have been defined by these horrible wars. He's like, no, most of human
competition between nations was like blood. I would say bloodthirsty without drinking that blood, in the sense that it was intense, it was loathsome, and so a lot of the rivalry and a lot of the competition, which is also can be problematic in its own ways, is not violent. And most of human history is about the oppression of the majority by a few. And there, there are moments when they rise up in revolt, and there's a revolution. We remember those, but most of the time they don't. And and the story of political change and
Because he's the
transformation
biggest
and
pimp on
freedom
earth.
is there's a few revolutions that are violent, but most of it is actually revolutions without that kind of violent revolt. Most of it is just the peaceful concession of power by elites to a wider group of people in response to their increased economic bargaining power, their threat that they're going to march. So even if we want to understand something like the March of Freedom over human history, I think we can draw the same insight that actually we don't, most of the time we don't fight. We actually concede power. Now you don't the elite doesn't sort of give power to the masses right away. They just co-opt the few merchants who could threaten the whole thing and bring them into the circle. And then the circle gets a little bit wider until the circle is ever widened. Maybe not ever, but encompasses most, if not all. And that's like a hopeful and optimistic trend.
Yeah, if you look at the plot, he doesn't pull it up with the wars throughout history. So the rate of wars throughout history does seem to be decreasing significantly with a few spikes, and sort of the expansion. It's like half the world is under authoritarian regimes, but that's been shrinking and shrinking and
Throwing
shrinking.
up gang signs like a pimp.
One of the famous scholar who brings up this hypothesis. I mean, there's sort of two ways. There's actually two separate kinds of violence. That one where I think he's completely right, and one where I think we're not sure, or maybe not. Where he's completely right, sort of interpersonal violence, homicides, everyday violence has been going down, 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 down. That's just kind of needlessly, and it's mostly because we created cultures and states and rules and things that control that violence. Now, the warfare between groups, is that less frequent? Well, it's not clear that he's right, that there's fewer wars. You might say that the wars are more rare because they're more costly, because our weapons are so brutal. The cost of war go up. As the cost of war go up, not
Accomplice
entirely, but for the
of
most part, that goes with the threat on
LGBTQIA
behalf of.
plus manhunt.
And but then
What
what
does
you
that
have
mean? Oh, this is that lawyer.
So is Pinker right? I hope he's right, but I don't think that officially that trend is there. I think
it's the best side. What is that bullshit?
That we might have
dog. Dog.
levels of
You might have a potato
violence
poopy.
because
Dog.
maybe those five fundamentals that lead to war have not fundamentally
Potato
changed,
poopy.
and thus made us given us a more peaceful world now than a couple hundred years ago.
That's something to think about. So obviously, looking at his hypothesis, looking at his data,
Potato
and others like him. But I have noticed one thing, which is the amount of pushback he gets.
Yeah.
That there is
Potato,
this speaking
tomato,
to the
potato,
general point
tomato,
that you made, which is like
potato,
we
tomato,
overemphasize the
and corn.
anecdotal,
Potato,
and
tomato,
don't
potato,
look
tomato.
objectively at the
Oh man,
aggregate
I
data
gotta take
as
a
much.
dizzy.
There's a general cynicism
One of the
about the
greatest
world,
poops
and I don't even
perhaps
mean
on earth.
cynicism.
Poop.
It's almost like
Poop.
cynicism porn or something like that, where people
I
just
hate
get,
a poop.
for some reason, they get a little bit excited to talk about the destruction.
Okay, that means I have to get up and walk. Oh, dude, it's so much work. Look at this move, though. Look at this.
I think. Uh-oh.
Oh, no. Oh, dog. Oh, dog. We're in the second butthole. Oh, dog. Oh, it's kind of.
I don't know, maybe it
Legend.
leaves
Oh,
the
dog.
mind to think about death
This is the
at a global
worst.
scale somehow, and then you
Server
can go have
boost.
lunch with your kids afterwards and feel a little better about the world. I don't know what it is, but that it's not very scientific. It's very kind of personal, emotional. So we should
Yo, dog, what is
be
this?
careful to look at the world in that way, because
all the memories are coming on the
there is
bathroom floor.
I do highlight
Dog.
a will for peace among people. Yeah. You mentioned Medellin.
Dog.
How do you pronounce it, Medellin or Medellin?
Both are fine. I think they mentioned
Look at this
that's
move.
kind of the accent.
Look at this athleticism.
Double L, but
Double L.
AGL. Fine as well.
Love.
What lessons do you draw from the Medellin cartel, from the different gang wars in Colombia and the economics of peace and war between drug cartels.
Here's what was really insightful for me. So I live in Chicago, and Chicago people are aware that there's a violence problem in Chicago. It's actually not the worst American city by any stretch of the imagination for shootings, but it's pretty bad. And Medellin has these many more, and probably many better organized gangs than Chicago. And yet the homicide rate is maybe half. And now, I mean, there have been moments when these gangs go to war the last 30 years when Medellin has become the most violent place on the planet. But for the most part, right now, they're peaceful. And so what's going on there? I mean, one thing that is there's a hierarchy of organizations, so that above these reasonably well-organized neighborhood gangs, there's a set of sort of more shadowy organizations that have different names. Some people call them razones, some people would call them bandas criminales, criminal bands. You might just call them mafias. And there's about 17 of them, depending on how you want to count. And they themselves have a little operating board sometimes they call it the office, la oficina, sometimes they call it la mesa, the table.
So each individual one, or as a group?
As a group. So they meet, and they don't meet personally all the time. Sometimes they meet, but they consult. A lot of the leaders of these groups are actually in prison, and they're in the same wings in prison.
They have representatives. Oh, they meet in prison.
Well, they're whatever. If I'm on the cell block with you and meeting you anyways, right? So actually imprisoning leaders and putting them in the same cell block, but not putting them in, if you get arrested here in the United States and you're a criminal leader and you get put in a supermax prison, you cannot run your criminal empire. It's just too difficult. It's impossible. There, it's possible. And you might think, and they do, they still run their empire. And you might think that's a bad idea. But actually, cutting off the head of a criminal organization, leading it to a bunch of like hot-headed young guys who are disorganized is not always the path to peace. So having these guys all in the same prison patios is actually it reduces imperfect information and uncertainty, right? It provides a place for them to bargain. They can talk, and so La Oficina is like a lot of these informal meetings. And so and they have these tools that they use to control the street gangs. So instead of there being like 400 gangs, all sort of in this anarchic situation, competing for territory and constantly at war, the razones are keeping them in line. And they will use sanctions. The sanction might be, I will put a bullet in your head if you don't.
A little more honest than sanctions accusation.
Exactly, but they will sit them down. They'll help them negotiate. They will provide commitment. I said there are these things called commitment problems, where like there's I have some incentive to like exterminate you, but that's going to be costly for everybody. So I'm going to have, what's the solution? Well, I'm going to provide commitment. I'm going to like enforce this deal. And yeah, you don't like this deal now because you could take advantage of your situation and wage war, but I'm going to give you a counter incentive. And so they keep the peace. And it's a little bit, so they're a little bit like the UN Security Council and peacekeeping forces and sanctions regimes. It's like the same kinds of tools, the same parallels, and they're imperfect. They don't always work that well, and they're unequal, right? Because it's not like they're pursuing this in the interests of like democratic, blah blah blah. But it kind of works until it doesn't. And 10 years ago, in the mid 1990s, there were wars, and this breaks down. And it kind of gave me this perspective on the international institutions and all the tools we've built, that we do the same things, right? Sanctions are designed to make unchecked leaders face the cost of war. It's a solution to one of the 5 problems, right? And mediators are a solution to uncertainty. And international institutions that can enforce a peace and agreement are a solution to commitment problems. And all of these things can be solutions to these intangible incentives, preferences, whatever you value, and miscalculations, because they will punish you for your miscalculation, or they will get a mediator to help you realize why you're miscalculating. So they're doing all these things, and it made me realize that the comparison to the UN Security Council and all our tools is actually a pretty good one, because those are pretty unequal too, and those are pretty imperfect. Like we have 5 nations with a veto on the Security Council, and a lot of unequal power, and they're manipulating this in their own self-interest or their group's interests. So anyway, so it's actually some of the things that work in Medellin and why they work help give me a lot of perspective on what works in the international arena and why we have some of the problems we have with it.
Because there's not, in some deep way, there's not a fundamental difference between those 17 mafia groups and
doing security caps.
Security caps. Oh, we're 620 descendant of apes. We put on suits. I'm sure they're wearing different cultural garbs that they wear. What are your thoughts? I mean, that's the sense they got from Pablo Escobar and Jorge Ochoa, who founded the Medellin cartel. Is like having spoken with people on this podcast, talked to Roger Reeves, who was a drug transporter. It seems like it was I don't know the right term, but it was very kind of professional and calm and didn't have a sense of danger to it, like it's negotiating. So like the danger is always on the table as a threat, as part of the calculation, but you're using that threat in order to de-escalate, in order to have peace. Everybody is interested in peace.
So something that happened last year, we were a little bit able to watch in real time because we had a few contacts. We've been meeting and talking to a lot of these leaders in prison and a bit outside of prison. Many of them will talk to us. And so the homicide rate, I mentioned homicide rate in Medellin, maybe 2/3 or half of the Chicago level. It had been climbing. Some of these street level gangs were starting to fight. Maybe at some level, it seems that like maybe some of those some leaders were like saying, well, we're actually not sure how strong these guys are. Let's let them fight just to test it out. Let's have these skirmishes, right? It wasn't prolonged warfare. It was like, let's just sort of feel out how strong everybody is, because then we'll be able to reapportion the drug corners and stuff accordingly. So they were kind of feeling each other out through fighting, and the homicide rate doubled, and then it increased by the same amount again. And so it's approaching something that might get out of control, which wasn't in anybody's interest. It wasn't in the government's interest. It wasn't in their interest. And so then magically, all these leaders in these patios, right? Different prisons, they're spread out around a bunch of prisons. Everybody gets transferred to a new prison on the same day, which means they all get to be in the same holding area for 3 days before they're all moved elsewhere. So the government had a role in this. And then somebody who's like a trusted mediator on the criminal side gets himself arrested, happens to be put in the same spot, and a week later, the homicide rate is 30% of what it was. Is back to its normal log. Unfortunately, not zero, right? But it's back to where it was because it didn't make sense to have a war, and everybody, government, mafia leaders, everybody sort of like they figured out a way to sort of bargain their way to peace.
Yeah, this is almost like a tangent, but you mentioned you got a chance potentially to talk to a few folks, some were in prison, some were not. Is it productive? Is it interesting? Maybe by way of advice, do you have ideas about talking to people who are actively criminals?
Yeah. It really depends on the situation. So, like, the first time I worked in a conflicted place was in northern Uganda in maybe the last couple of years of a long-running war. So this would have been 2004, 2005. This is a small East African country, and the north of the country had been engulfed in, think of it as like a 20-year low-level insurgency run by a self-proclaimed messiah. Wasn't that popular, and no one joined his movement, so he would kidnap kids. And so I could talk to people who would come back from being there. I never once, if I wanted to, and I was writing about that armed group, I never talked to anybody who was an active member of that armed group. It was quite rare. It wouldn't have been easy or safe. And that's sometimes true. I'm starting to do some work in Mexico, probably, and I'm not going to be talking to people. They'll kill people.
You say you're not going to talk to them, and they'll kill people. Which people?
So, I mean, journalists are routinely killed for knowing too much in Mexico. There's no compunctions about killing them, and there's no consequences.
Who kills a journalist? It's not the main people that you spoke with. It's their lackeys, or is it rival?
No, so
gangs.
This is true of a Chicago gang, and this is true of Medellin gang. It's probably true of a Mexico gang. Is like you might have your group of 30 people. One or two of them might be shooters. Most people don't shoot. Most people don't like to do that. Or you don't even have any of those people in your group because you're trying to run a business. You don't even need shooters. You can just hire a killer when you need them on contract. And so if somebody's asking questions and you don't want them to ask questions, or you think they know too much in a way that threatens you, and it's cheap for you, and you have no personal functions, then you can put a contract out on them and they'll be killed. That doesn't happen in Colombia. Doesn't happen in Chicago. I don't know. There's lots of reasons for that. I can't say exactly why. I think one reason is like they know what'll happen is that there'll be consequences. That the government will crack down and make them pay, and so they don't do it. And that's not what happened. They won't kill like a DA agent. They know that the U.S. has made it clear: you kill one of our agents, we will make you pay. And so they're very careful to minimize death of Americans. But you kill journalists, and nobody comes after them, or is able to come after them. And so they realize they can get away with this, and that seems to be the equilibrium there. That's my initial sense from. But we spent a lot of time before we started talking to criminals. We spent a year trying to figure out what was safe before we actually and failing. There are lots of safe things to do. It's also really hard to figure out how to talk to people in these organizations, and we failed 40 times before we figured out a way to actually access people.
Is it worth it talking to them if you figure out, because it's never going to be safe, it's going to be when you estimate that there's just some low level of risk. Like, what's the benefit as a researcher, as a scholar of humans?
Yeah. So I actually don't think. Let's compare it to something. Okay, I'm in Austin for the first time, and I'm walking around, and there's all these people buzzing around on these scooters without helmets.
We need to definitely interview them and say what the hell is wrong with you.
So nothing I have ever done in my entire career is as risky as that.
That's a nice way to compare journalism and war zone.
Scooters. There's some war zone. I worked in northern Uganda, and I worked in Liberia, and I work now in Medellin, and I'm starting to work in Mexico. And both those particular places, and then the things I did in those places, where I spent a lot of time making sure that what I was doing was not unduly risky.
Hey, Todd, could you pull up a picture of a person on a scooter in Austin so we can just compare this absurd situation where I doubt it's the riskiest thing, because now we have to look at the data. I understand the point you were making, but
So I'm not trying to say there's zero risk. I think there's like a calculated risk, and I think you become good at you work at becoming good at being able to assess these risks and know who can help you assess these risks.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect to it too. When you're riding a scooter, once you're done with the scooter, the risk has disappeared.
Yeah.
There's something lingering where you have to look over your shoulder, potentially for the rest of your life, as you accumulate all these conversations.
Yeah, I've chosen, but I've also advised my students. I wouldn't go and do this with a group that would think I knew too much, and therefore some people do that. Some journalists, I think, are very brave to take risks and do that, and it's good for them, and I'm happy they do that. I don't personally do that. So these guys are very. I mean, Medellin is a business. They're selling local drugs, and they are laundering money for the big cartels, and they are shaking down businesses for money or selling services in some cases, and they make a lot of money. It's a business, and they're in prison, so they can talk about most of what they want to talk about because there's no double jeopardy. They've been incarcerated for it, and you're just talking shop, and they're just so it's worth it. I think because the risk is very low. But if you actually want to weaken these organizations, so they're extremely powerful, they're extremely big facet of life in a lot of cities in these Americas in particular, including some American cities. If you want to understand how to weaken these groups over time, you have to understand how their business works. Whatever the oil czars of the United States, or maybe you're in charge of the financial system, right? If you're the regulator, for oil, energy, or for finance, and then you get your job, and someone says, and then you're like, well, how many firms are there, and what do they sell, and what are the prices? And everyone's like, well, we don't really know. You would not be very good regulator, right? And if you're a policeman or you're someone who's in charge of counter-organized crime, you're just a regulator. You're trying to regulate an illicit industry. You're regulating an industry that happens to be illicit, and you have no information. And so that's kind of what we do. We figure out how the system works. And what are the economic incentives and what are the political incentives?
And the interviews and conversations help with that.
They help a lot. Yeah. We do that. So we have, I do some of those, but on the side, my Spanish is okay. It's not great.
And you have a translator usually if you ever go directly?
Well, it's only because I can't understand the street executive. Like, I'm just totally hopeless. Nor could many people who speak Spanish in the second language. Totally. You go to prison, you talk to these guys, and they're speaking in the local dialect, and it's tough. But more importantly, like, I just don't need to be there. That's not I'm a quantitative scholar. I'm the guy who collects the data. So we have people on our team and colleagues and employees who are doing full-time interviews. So, and then I just sometimes go with them. So,
what about you mentioned Uganda?
Yeah.
Joseph Kony, the Ugandan warlord. I mean, I've seen here he kidnapped 591 children in 3 years between 2000.
Holy, they must have kidnapped. They probably kidnapped short time, and so this dream came from the north of the country. That was like the power base, and it was dictatorial. So you've heard of like people like Idi Amin, people heard of like Milton Obote, and all these people were all from the north. And then you get the current president who came to power in 1986. So he's been around a long time. He's going to be 70. He was from the south, and he was fighting against these dictators, and he was fighting for a freer and better Uganda. And in many ways, I mean, he's still a dictator himself, but he did create a freer and better Uganda. So he's better than what's before him. And he came to power, and he was like, and the Northerners were like, we want to keep